Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. Most of the stories on this channel are cautionary tales. Men who came here chasing something, love, a fresh start, a cheaper life, and found out the hard way that the Philippines has its own ideas about how those stories end. We've heard from men who lost their savings, their dignity, their sense of who they were. And those stories are important. They're why this channel exists. But you've been asking for a different kind of story. Not a disaster, not a fantasy either. Something in between. Something honest. The kind of story where a man sits down, looks you in the eye, and tells you what retiring here on a fixed income actually looks like. Not the YouTube version. The real version. That's what we have today. Niall Corrigan is 65 years old. He's a retired plumber from County Roscommon, spent most of his working life in Dublin, ran his own operation for nearly 3 decades. He's not a romantic. He's not someone who saw a travel video and started dreaming about beaches. He's the kind of man who checks the pipe diameter before he quotes the job. About 14 months ago, he packed a bag and moved to the Philippines on his pension. And what happened, what he found, what it cost him, what it nearly cost him, and what he learned is one of the most useful things we've put on this channel. Fair warning, some of what he's going to tell you is uncomfortable. Honest answers usually are. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I'm not going to dress this up. I'm a plumber from Roscommon who spent 28 years on his knees under other people's sinks. That's the beginning and the middle of it. I started the business in my late 30s with a second-hand van and a toolbox I'd been adding to since my apprenticeship, and I built it up slow. Residential mostly, some light commercial, a bit of everything by the end. I had 2 lads working for me at the peak of it, though one of them was my nephew and I'm not sure he counts. I retired at 64. Sold the van to a young fella from Talat who seemed capable enough. Sold the tools in lots on done deal. Closed the business account. And then I sat in my kitchen in Clondalkin on a Tuesday morning with a mug of tea and absolutely nothing to do. And I thought, right, this is it, so. That feeling. I don't know what to call it exactly. It wasn't depression. I've known men with depression, and it's not the same thing. It was more like silence. The kind that comes after 40 years of noise. I'd always had somewhere to be. A job to price, a call to return, a leak that wouldn't wait. And then suddenly, there was nothing that wouldn't wait. Everything could wait. Nothing needed me. The kids were fine. I want to be clear about that. Ciaran is in Vancouver. Software something? I don't fully understand what he does, but he seems to be doing well at it. Eweef's in Melbourne. Married to a fella called Josh. 2 children I've met twice in person and know mostly from photographs. Shian's outside Toronto, which is where he went for a working holiday 12 years ago and apparently decided to stay. I have 5 grandchildren in total. I know their names and their approximate heights, and not much else, if I'm honest with you. They have their lives. I'm not bitter about it. That would be a waste of energy, and anyway, it wouldn't change anything. But I'll tell you this much. A house that used to have kids in it, and then doesn't, has a particular kind of quiet that you never fully get used to. And Clondalkin in January, with the rain on the kitchen window and the telly going in the background and nothing on it worth watching. That's a specific feeling. A cold, gray, specific feeling. I wasn't unhappy. I just wasn't anything much. So I did what I'd always done when I had a problem I didn't know how to solve. I sat down and tried to understand it properly before I touched anything. I started watching YouTube. Not the romantic stuff, not travel vlogs with fellas in linen shirts standing on beaches. I'd no patience for that. I was looking for numbers. What things cost. What a pension actually buys in different parts of the world. Whether there was somewhere that made more financial sense than sitting in Clondalkin watching the rain. I'll be straight with you. I was skeptical of the whole thing. I'd seen enough of those channels. Men my age reinventing themselves in Southeast Asia, raving about how they'd never go back. And there's always something slightly desperate about it that I didn't want to be. That slightly too wide smile, the way they talk about their life back home like it was a prison sentence they'd escaped. I didn't want any part of that. But I kept watching because the numbers were interesting. And numbers don't lie, or at least they don't lie as often as people do. Thailand came up constantly. I ruled it out fairly quickly. Felt like a well-worn path, and not in a good way. Vietnam interested me more, but the language situation put me off. I'm 65 years of age, and I spent 4 decades managing subcontractors, chasing invoices, explaining to people what needed doing and why. I've neither the time nor the patience to be functionally illiterate somewhere. That's not arrogance. That's just knowing what I can't be bothered with at this stage. The Philippines kept appearing, and the thing that stopped me scrolling past it wasn't the beaches. It was the fact that they speak English. Properly. Not tourist English, actual conversational English, taught in schools, used in workplaces. That was not a small thing to me. That was, if I'm being precise about it, probably the deciding factor. The second factor was the numbers. I have 2 pensions, the Irish state pension and a small private one I'd been paying into since the late 90s. Together they come to roughly €1,800 a month. In Dublin, that's not a life. That's utilities, groceries, and if you're careful, maybe 1 night out a month. It keeps the lights on. That's what it does. But the forums, and I was deeply skeptical of the forums, because tradesmen always make their situation sound better than it is, and I assumed the same applied to retired expats. Even discounting everything by 30%, the figures being described in the Philippines made a kind of sense that Dublin simply doesn't. Not a fantasy, just a different equation. I booked a flight in February 2024. Return ticket. 3 weeks. Deliberately booked nothing beyond 3 nights in a hotel in Makati, because I wanted to see what it actually was before I committed to anything. That's how I've always worked. You go in, you have a look at what's actually there, and then you decide what it needs. I wasn't running toward something. I was running the numbers on whether somewhere else made more sense. That's a different thing entirely. Or, at least, that's what I told myself. Manila hit me like opening a boiler room door. That wall of heat when you step out of the airport, not warm, heat, the kind that has weight to it. And then the smell, which is exhaust fumes and something sweet underneath that I couldn't identify, and still can't. It was 11:30 at night, and it was 30 degrees. I stood outside the arrivals hall at NAIA Terminal 3 with my 1 bag, and thought, right, this is a different planet, so. I'd booked 3 nights at a mid-range place in Makati. Nothing fancy. I wasn't going to spend money on a hotel when I didn't know yet if the whole thing was worth pursuing. The taxi driver talked the entire way into the city, and I understood about 70% of what he said, which was already better than I'd managed with some subcontractors in Dublin. So that was something. Makati by night is, well, it's a lot. The Ayala Avenue end of it looks like any modern business district, glass towers and chain coffee shops, could be Singapore or Frankfurt if you didn't look too closely. But you turn a corner, and there's a street food cart with a woman selling fish balls at midnight, and 3 lads playing basketball under a single floodlight, and a sari-sari store still open, with an old man watching a boxing match on a tiny television behind the counter. The contrasts happen fast. You don't get time to adjust between them. I spent 3 days in Makati feeling, as I said, like a Colchi who'd taken a wrong turn. Not unwelcome. People were decent, almost disarmingly so, but it wasn't a place I could see myself. Too big, too fast. The traffic was genuinely something else. Jeepneys and tricycles and grab cars, all negotiating the same lanes with a logic I couldn't follow. I ate at a Jollibee near the hotel one evening, mostly out of curiosity. Ordered the Chicken Joy, which is their fried chicken, and a rice meal. 189 pesos, which is about €3. The chicken was grand, actually, better than I expected. But Makati wasn't where I was going to retire. I knew that by day 2. I'd done enough reading on the forums to know the places worth looking at for actual retirement living. Quieter, cheaper, manageable, and Dumaguete kept coming up with the kind of consistency that made me pay attention. Negros Oriental, down in the Visayas. University town, they said. Smaller, walkable. A reasonable expat community, but not one that had taken the place over completely. I took the Ceres bus south to Bacolod, and then a ferry across to Dumaguete. The bus journey was about 4 hours and cost me 280 pesos, which is less than €5, and I was the only foreigner on it, and nobody bothered me or looked at me twice, which I also took as a good sign. The ferry was another hour. By the time I arrived, I'd been traveling for most of the day, and I was tired, and my back was complaining about the bus seats. Checked into a small guest house near the boulevard, 1,100 pesos a night, roughly €18, and had a shower and went to bed. The next morning, I walked the boulevard. Rizal Boulevard, it runs along the waterfront, and there's a seawall and palm trees and people jogging in the early morning before the heat gets going properly. The water isn't crystal blue like the postcards, it's the Visayan Sea, a working body of water, cargo boats in the distance. But there's a breeze off it in the morning and the light is something. I'm not a man who talks about light, normally, but it was something. I found a place for breakfast near the market. A small canteen sort of affair, plastic chairs and a laminated menu, run by a woman who I'd guess was in her 50s, and who brought me rice and eggs and a small serve of what turned out to be pork adobo before I'd fully sat down. The whole thing cost 95 pesos. That's under €2. I sat with that receipt for a moment, I'll admit. Just looked at it. I spent the rest of that first week in Dumaguete doing what I'd come to do. Proper assessment. I walked every part of the town I could get to on foot. I found the Robinsons Mall, which has a supermarket and a Mercury drug, and all the things you'd need for ordinary life. I found the 2 main hospitals, Silliman University Medical Center and Holy Child Hospital, and noted their locations without going in, the same way I'd note where the stopcock was before starting a job. Good to know. Hope you don't need it. I ate at different places every day and kept a note of the cost of everything. Not obsessively, just professionally. I was pricing the job. I sat one afternoon at a cafe on the boulevard, Kiosco, it's called, right on the water, with a San Miguel and my notebook. A San Miguel costs about 65 pesos there, roughly €1. I had the notebook open, and I was adding up what an ordinary week had cost me. Food, transport, the guest house, a couple of incidentals. The weekly total, excluding accommodation, was somewhere around 4,500 pesos. That's about €72. For a week of eating well and moving around freely. Now, I've been a careful man with money my whole life. Self-employed men have to be. There's no one to bail you out when January is slow. I know how to read a quote, and I know how to read a week's expenditure. And what I was looking at on that page told me that the formula the forums had been describing wasn't as inflated as I'd assumed. Not free, not cheap exactly, but a different order of magnitude from Dublin. The hypothesis was holding up. That was all I needed to know. I extended my stay by a week without really deciding to. Just called the guest house and said I'd keep the room. There was a part of me, and I'm aware this sounds dramatic from a man who just described himself as someone who runs the numbers. There was a part of me that didn't want to go back. Not yet. Not to the rain and the quiet kitchen and the grandchildren on a phone screen. I told myself I was still gathering data. Maybe that was true. The point is, I was still there. And I was walking the streets of a city where nobody knew me, eating adobo for less than €2, and feeling, for the first time in a while, like the shape of the day was something I'd chosen rather than something that had chosen me. Whether that feeling was reliable information or just the relief of being somewhere warm after a Dublin winter, I wasn't entirely sure. I'm still not entirely sure, and I've been here 14 months. But I started looking at apartments. The way I find accommodation is the same way I've always priced a job. You don't ring the first number you see on a flyer. You ask around. You find out who the landlord is before you sign anything. You look at the pipes. I asked the woman who ran the guest house. Her name was Nelia. She'd been running the place for 20 years and knew everything about everyone in a 2-kilometer radius. Whether she knew of any apartments to rent nearby, not through an agency. Just, did she know anyone? She thought about it for about 4 seconds and said her cousin's husband had a building near the market, 1-bedroom units, and that the owner was a retired schoolteacher who kept the place well. She made a call. I went and had a look that same afternoon. The building was on a side street about 10 minutes' walk from the boulevard, tucked between a hardware store and a small bakery that started up at 5 in the morning and made the whole street smell of bread for about 2 hours, which I came to regard as a reasonable alarm clock. The apartment itself was on the 2nd floor. 1 bedroom, a living area with a small kitchen along one wall, a bathroom with an actual water heater, not the instant shower kind, a proper tank, and an aircon unit in the bedroom that looked like it had been installed in the last 5 years. Security gate on the ground floor, relatively clean, no particular smell. The landlord was a man named Mr. Velasquez, 70-something, who shook my hand carefully and showed me around with the manner of a man who had once explained things to students for a living and still defaulted to it. He pointed out the water pressure, the electrical sockets, the location of the fuse box. I could have kissed him, honestly. A man who shows you the fuse box without being asked is a man you can do business with. He wanted 20,000 pesos a month. That's roughly €320. I said I'd been quoted 18,000 pesos elsewhere, which was a slight exaggeration. I'd seen that figure on a forum. And he said nothing for a moment, and then said 18,500 pesos. And I said grand, and we shook hands again. I'm not sure either of us was particularly invested in the negotiation. It felt more like a formality we both understood the shape of. I moved in 10 days later, flew back to Dublin, sorted the house, put it with a letting agent, which is a whole other story I won't get into here, packed what I needed into 2 bags, and came back. The whole turnaround was about 3 weeks. People ask me sometimes if I was nervous, making that decision so quickly. I wasn't. I'd looked at what I needed to look at. The pipes were sound. So, the budget. I'm going to walk you through this properly because this is the part most of these videos skip over or dress up, and I promised you an honest answer. Rent was 18,500 pesos a month. Call it €925. Food and groceries I budgeted at 8,000 pesos a month. About €400. That included eating out maybe once a day and cooking the rest of the time at the apartment. Dumaguete has a good market near the Robinsons. Fruit, vegetables, fish, pork, and you can eat well for not much if you're willing to cook. I'm a competent enough cook. Nothing fancy. I can manage rice and whatever needs using up, which is essentially what Filipino home cooking is as well, so I felt at home in that sense. Utilities, electricity, water, a local SIM with data, I budgeted 4,000 pesos a month, roughly €200. I knew the electricity could spike in the hot months because of the aircon, but I hadn't fully accounted for how hot the hot months actually get. I'll come back to that. And then a miscellaneous category of 3,000 pesos a month, €150 for transport, incidentals, the odd bit of leisure. Tricycle rides around town cost about 15 pesos, which is 20 cents. That part was accurate enough. Total projected monthly spend, 33,500 pesos, roughly €1,650, which left me about €150 surplus per month on my pension. Not a lot, but workable. I'd budgeted tight all my life. Now, here's where I want to stop and talk to you directly, because this is the part that nobody, and I mean nobody, in the retirement content I watched mentioned properly. Not once. About 4 weeks in, I started looking at private health insurance. I'd known my Irish medical card was worthless here. Well, I'd known it in the way you know something you haven't fully decided to confront yet. The same way you know there's a drip under the kitchen sink, but you've put a bowl under it and told yourself you'll deal with it next week. I knew. I just hadn't looked at the actual numbers. I spent an afternoon on the laptop getting quotes. International health insurance for a 65-year-old male, Philippines-based, decent coverage, not gold-plated, just functional, the kind that would get me into a private hospital room if something went wrong. The quotes came back between 20,000 pesos and 25,000 pesos a month. That's somewhere between 1,000 and 1,250 euro. I sat with that figure for a while, a few days, actually. I kept opening the spreadsheet and staring at it, and then closing it again, which is very unlike me. A man who's priced thousands of jobs over 28 years doesn't usually flinch at a number. But this number had a particular quality to it. It didn't just change the budget. It replaced the budget. It made the budget I'd built into something I didn't recognize. There was no version of the maths where 25,000 pesos in insurance and 1,800 euros in pension and 1,650 euros in living costs added up to anything except a monthly deficit. That's not a formula. That's a drain. I found a plan at 22,000 pesos a month that I thought was adequate. Adequate. Not comprehensive, there's a difference. And I made the decision I think anyone sensible has to make. Carry the insurance. Non-negotiable. You are 65 years old in a country with no public health system that applies to you. And if something goes wrong and you're uninsured, the savings you spent 30 years accumulating will disappear faster than you can make a phone call. But once I'd committed to that, I had to look at everything else differently. The 150 euro surplus was gone. I was now, on paper, spending almost exactly what I earned. Every single month. With essentially nothing left over for anything unplanned. Some of you watching this will think that sounds manageable. Some of you will think it sounds terrifying. It's both, if I'm honest. It's both. What it meant practically was this. The savings, the 42,000 euros I'd come here with from selling the tools and the van and a few other bits and pieces, those weren't a retirement fund anymore. They were a safety net. The only safety net. And a safety net that you're slowly cutting holes in every time something unexpected happens isn't really a safety net at all. It's a timetable. I didn't panic. I'm not a man who panics. But I did sit in the apartment that evening with a Red Horse beer. A local beer, very strong. I'd been warned about it and ignored the warning. That's a separate lesson. And I thought, right. This is what it actually is. Now you know. And I did know. Which was more than I'd known before I came. Which was, in a way, the whole point of the trip. I am not a joiner. I want to be clear about that before I explain why I ended up at a table with 7 foreign men in a coffee shop off Purtices Street every Tuesday morning for 4 months. The expat scene in Dumaguete, and there is one, make no mistake, exists in a few forms. There are the bars along the boulevard that cater to foreigners, where the San Miguel is cold and the conversation is loud and circular, and you can hear variations of the same 3 stories on rotation. There are the Facebook groups, which I'd been in and out of since before I arrived, and which are useful for finding apartments, and useless for almost everything else because the signal-to-noise ratio is approximately 1:40. And then there are the informal meetups. Coffee mornings, somebody called them, which is a grand term for a group of men sitting around with their Americanos, pretending they're just there for information rather than company. I found out about the Tuesday coffee from a post in one of the forums. Someone asking about Bureau of Immigration procedures for extending a tourist visa past the initial 30 days. The response came from a man who signed off with a meetup time and location. I went once, I told myself, because I needed to know about the visa. I'd look stupid getting deported for overstaying when I was trying to retire quietly, not make a scene. The coffee shop was a place called Hayahai, which does actually serve decent coffee, and also has a view of the water, which I suspect is why the group had chosen it rather than for any practical reason. There were 6 other men there the first time. I won't name them, but I'll describe the spread, because the spread is the thing that's actually useful to know. On one end of the table, 2 men who had arrived in the last 18 months, and who talked about Dumaguete the way people talk about a discovery they've made that they need you to understand the significance of. One of them, an American, was in a relationship with a woman 35 years younger than him and was paying her rent, her family's phone bills, her sister's university fees, 45,000 pesos a month in total, he mentioned at one point, roughly €720. And he described this with the tone of a man explaining a reasonable business arrangement that he'd thought through carefully. I said nothing. It wasn't my place. But I noticed the way he said it, slightly too quickly, slightly too firmly, the way you talk when you've already had the argument with yourself, and you're still not sure you won. The other end of the table was more interesting to me. 3 men who'd been in Dumaguete between 8 and 14 years. A retired Canadian engineer named Doug, who had the unhurried quality of someone who'd stopped trying to explain himself to anyone. A Dutchman named Peter, who'd married a local woman 15 years ago, and spoke some Cebuano, and was the only person at the table who seemed genuinely unremarkable, in the best possible sense. Just a man who lived here, same as he'd lived somewhere else before, and a retired British teacher from Yorkshire named Brian, who had the particular dry precision of someone who spent 30 years telling teenagers things they didn't want to know, and had come to regard that as a transferable skill. These 3 I paid attention to. They talked about the Philippines the way I talk about plumbing, with the respect of people who understood what they were dealing with and had stopped being surprised by it. From them, over the weeks I kept attending. And I kept attending because the information was genuinely useful, not for any other reason. I want to be precise about that. I learned the following things. The tourist visa situation. You arrive on a 30-day stamp, and you can extend it at the Bureau of Immigration in increments, 2 months at a time, up to a maximum of about 3 years before you need to exit and re-enter. Each extension costs around 4,000 to 5,000 pesos, roughly 60 to 80 euro, plus a fee to a fixer if you use one, which several of them recommended for saving time. Doug went to the BI office in Dumaguete himself every 2 months and described the process as character building. Peter had a marriage visa and didn't have to deal with it, which he mentioned without gloating, just as a fact. Which hospitals worked? Silliman University Medical Center for most things, they said. Holy Child for certain specialists. For anything serious, cardiac, oncology, major surgery, Cebu City was the answer. A 2,500 peso ferry ride and about an hour, or fly if it was urgent. Brian told me something about rent that I'd already half figured out but needed confirmed. Never pay more than 3 months up front as a new tenant, because the legal situation for foreigners in property disputes is not straightforward, and you want to be able to leave a bad situation without losing too much. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was telling me the water pressure drops on the 3rd floor. And then the family obligation conversation. This came up one Tuesday when another man at the table, one of the newer arrivals, mentioned that his girlfriend's mother had had a fall and needed a hospital bill covered. 38,000 pesos, about €600. He'd paid it. He was asking, retrospectively, whether that was the right call. The 3 older men exchanged a look that wasn't unkind, but was very knowing. Brian was the one who answered. He said, "And I'm going to try to get this right, because I've thought about it many times since. The question isn't whether the hospital bill was real. It probably was. The question is, what happens next month? Because the expectation that you will help with the next thing, the next emergency, the next school fee, the next roof, that expectation doesn't diminish after you help once. It becomes the baseline." He paused and had a sip of his coffee. He said, "Decide what you're willing to give on a regular basis, as if it's a line item in your budget, and give that consistently and without drama. Or decide you can't give anything, and be clear about that from the start. But do not," and this was the phrase that lodged somewhere behind my eyes, "do not let the first ask be the moment you figure out your position. Because by then, you're already in the conversation emotionally, and you won't think straight." I wrote that down. Not obviously, not during the meeting, but that evening I opened the notebook I'd been using for the budget, and I wrote it on the inside back cover. Decide before you're asked. I didn't know at the time that I'd be tested on this in about 4 months, but I'm glad I'd written it down. Mr. Velasquez's daughter was named Maricel. Mid-30s, I'd guess, though I'm not good at ages. She lived somewhere nearby and came to the building most mornings to deal with whatever needed dealing with. A broken light in the common area, a tenant with a query about the water bill, the small administrative texture of keeping a building functioning. She managed it the way competent people manage things, without drama, without requiring you to notice. I noticed because I recognized the type. I'd worked with people like that for years, the ones who just handled things. They're worth paying attention to. The first few months, she and I had a perfectly straightforward landlord-tenant relationship conducted entirely in logistics. She told me the water pressure could drop on Wednesday mornings when the building across the road was refilling their tanks. I told her the tap in the common area bathroom was dripping and I'd fix it if she could get me a washer. She got me the washer. I fixed the tap. That was the nature of it. Somewhere around month 4 or 5, I'd call it June, the heat was serious by then, the aircon running most of the day, the familiarity became something slightly warmer without becoming something different. She started leaving mangoes outside my door occasionally. Philippine mangoes, not the ones you get at home. A different thing entirely. Yellow and small and sweet enough to be mildly alarming. I thanked her, and she waved it off as if it was nothing, which it was and wasn't, depending on how you understand these things. I didn't fully understand them yet. I was invited to a cousin's graduation party in July. This was presented as an invitation rather than an obligation, and I believed it was genuinely that, which I still believe. The party was at a family house about 20 minutes from the boulevard by tricycle, a solid concrete bungalow with a covered area out the back where about 60 people were arranged around tables with bottles of Red Horse and plates of lechon and pancit. I was the only foreigner there. I brought a box of pastries from a bakery near the Robinsons, which the coffee group had told me was an appropriate pasalubong. A gift when you're arriving somewhere, they'd explained, particularly food. Nobody made a fuss about my presence. I was introduced to various relatives whose names I immediately lost, and a very old woman who was apparently the grandmother, and who held my hand and said something in Cebuano that made everyone nearby smile. I stayed 2 hours, ate well, took a tricycle home. The whole evening felt, and I know this sounds like damning with faint praise, entirely without agenda, which it was, as far as I could tell. And then, August. Maricel knocked on my door on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. She'd normally text if she needed something. I was having my coffee, and I let her in, and she sat down on the edge of the chair across from me, with the air of someone who had thought about what they wanted to say before saying it, which I also recognized as a quality worth paying attention to. She explained that her family had a house in Cebu, in the province, a few hours from Cebu City. The roof needed replacing before the typhoon season. The estimate from a local contractor was 80,000 pesos. That's roughly 4,000 euro. She asked carefully, and with what I can only describe as genuine acknowledgement that the answer might be no, whether I'd be willing to contribute. She was not aggressive about it. She was not tearful. She didn't invoke God's plan, or call it a blessing, or apply any of the rhetorical pressure I'd heard described at the Tuesday coffee. She asked a question, and then she waited. I said I'd think about it and let her know. She said, "Of course, no hurry," and that was that. I spent 2 weeks with that conversation. And what I want to say to anyone watching this, because this is the thing I couldn't find anyone talking about honestly, is that the difficulty wasn't emotional pressure. It was genuine uncertainty. I sat with it every morning with my coffee, and I couldn't determine the answer to a very simple question. Is this manipulation, or is this just how things work here? Because here's what I knew. Filipino family obligation is real. It's not a performance. Millions of Filipinos work abroad specifically to support families back home. It's the entire logic of the OFW system. The whole architecture of how families survive across generations. The expectation that a person with resources helps family isn't invented for the benefit of foreign men. It's a thing that exists. A roof before typhoon season is not an invented problem. Cebu province gets hit regularly. And I also knew 80,000 pesos was 4,000 euro. 4,000 euro was 10% of my entire savings. My only buffer. My safety net. And if I gave it once, even once, with the warmth and genuine goodwill I'd been shown for 6 months, what would the next ask look like? And the one after? Brian's voice from the Tuesday coffee. Decide before you're asked. I'd written it down. I'd thought about it. I knew my answer already. I just needed the 2 weeks to be sure I wasn't being hasty or rude or culturally obtuse. On a Thursday morning, I knocked on Maricel's door downstairs. I said I was sorry. I couldn't help with the roof. I said my budget was tighter than it might appear from the outside, which was true, and that I couldn't set a financial precedent I wouldn't be able to maintain, which was also true. I said I hoped the family found a solution, and I meant it. She said she understood. She was not cold about it. She wasn't warm in the particular way people are warm when they're managing their disappointment for your benefit. She was just normal. Matter of fact, she said she appreciated me telling her directly rather than making excuses. And something about that landed in a way I hadn't expected. The mangoes continued. The building management continued. Nothing changed. I've thought about that moment quite a lot since. Whether I was right, whether the ask was calculated or genuine or both simultaneously, which I suspect is often the answer, I genuinely don't know. I think she needed a roof. I think she also knew I was a foreigner, with what looked like resources, and that asking was worth trying. I don't think those two things are in contradiction. I think that's just people being people. Everywhere, always. Using what they have, trying what makes sense to try. But I also think this. Had I not written that sentence in the back of the notebook 4 months earlier, I would have given her the money. I would have found a way to justify it, and I would have spent the rest of the year in a different kind of anxiety than the one I was already managing. That's the lesson. Not that Filipinos will exploit you. Not that you should keep your wallet closed and your suspicion high. The lesson is that you have to know your own position before the conversation happens, because the conversation itself is not a good time to figure it out. When I was self-employed, I did a year-end account every January without fail. Not because I enjoyed it, nobody enjoys it, but because a business that doesn't know what it actually spent versus what it thought it would spend isn't a business. It's a guess with a bank account. I did it for 28 years, and I wasn't going to stop just because I'd retired. So in January 2025, exactly 1 year after I'd sat in the Clondalkin kitchen watching YouTube videos about Southeast Asia in the rain, I opened the spreadsheet and I did the audit. I'm going to walk you through it, because this is the chapter of the story that nobody tells you, and it's the only chapter that actually matters if you're sitting there thinking about doing what I did. Rent first. Rent held. 18,500 pesos a month. Same as agreed. Same as budgeted. Mr. Velasquez is the kind of man who doesn't change the terms midway through. That's one line that landed where I expected it to. Food did not. I'd budgeted 8,000 pesos a month. The actual average across 12 months was closer to 10,000 pesos, roughly €640 annually, more than projected. The reason is straightforward and slightly embarrassing. I ate out more than I'd planned, not extravagantly. A bowl of sinigang at a place near the market, 150 pesos. A plate of grilled fish at a carinderia down from the boulevard, 120 pesos. But the Tuesday coffee mornings occasionally became Tuesday lunches, and there were a few day trips. One to Apo Island with a group from the coffee, a weekend ferry to Siquijor that cost me 800 pesos return plus accommodation. And none of those were in the original model. Small amounts, not small collectively, as I said to myself at the time with some irritation. Utilities, the aircon. I'd budgeted 4,000 pesos a month for electricity, water, and my SIM. Between April and September, when Dumaguete is genuinely hot in a way that isn't fully communicable to someone who has only experienced Irish summers, the electricity bill alone ran to 5,500 pesos some months. I ran the aircon from early afternoon until morning because sleeping without it wasn't really sleeping. Annual utility average ended up at 5,500 pesos a month. €100 more per month than I had projected. Not catastrophic. But €100 a month is €1,200 a year. And €1,200 is not nothing when your margin is already thin. Healthcare insurance. I'd found a slightly better plan at month 6. Same level of coverage. 22,000 pesos a month rather than the 25,000 pesos I'd initially been quoted. I'll call that a small win. It's still 22,000 pesos a month. Still the largest single line in the budget after rent. In October, I had an ear infection. This is not a dramatic story. I woke up one morning, and my left ear was blocked and painful, and I went to Silliman University Medical Center, because that's where the expat group had said to go. Consultation, examination, prescription. 4,500 pesos out of pocket. About €280, because the visit fell under the excess threshold on my insurance plan. I want to mention this specifically because it's the kind of thing the YouTube retirement content never bothers with. You will get sick. Something minor will happen. And minor here costs money in a way that it doesn't when you have an Irish medical card and a GP surgery down the road. Visa extensions, 3 of them across the year, each one a trip to the Bureau of Immigration on Purtices Street, each one costing 4,100 pesos in fees. Total, 12,300 pesos. Roughly €770 for the year, just to maintain the legal right to be here. Doug had called this process character building, and he wasn't wrong, but it's also a budget line that doesn't appear in most retirement content, because most retirement content is made by people who either got the SRRV visa or married someone, or simply don't mention it. And then the flight. Sean got married in October, outside Toronto, a venue somewhere in the countryside, his partner's family. He rang me in August to tell me, and there was a quality to his voice when he asked if I'd be coming that I hadn't heard from him in a while. I booked the flight the same day. Dublin return from Cebu, fly Cebu to Manila, Manila to Heathrow, Heathrow to Dublin, cost me €780. I was home for 9 days, attended the wedding, stayed with my sister in Drumcondra, ate a Supermax in Blanchardstown, which was both unnecessary and completely necessary, and came back. That flight is the number that nearly broke the budget. Not broke it in the sense of disaster. Broke it in the sense of making the 12-month maths unambiguous. Total actual spend for the year, including the flight home, including the ear infection, including the visa runs, and the Siquijor weekend, and the slightly higher food bill, I drew €3,200 from savings. My €42,000 reserve is now approximately €38,800. I want you to sit with that figure for a moment, because it's the honest answer to whether this works. The pension covered the ordinary life. The pension did not cover the extraordinary life. And by extraordinary, I don't mean anything remarkable, I mean a wedding, a minor medical incident, and a weekend ferry to a neighboring island. Those things came out of savings. At that rate, the savings last about 12 years. I'm 65. 12 years gets me to 77, which is, well, it's either fine or it isn't, depending on things I can't predict. There's also something the numbers don't fully capture. And I'm aware this sounds odd coming from me, a man whose entire relationship with this experience has been mediated through a spreadsheet. But there is a low-level anxiety that comes with a thin margin. Not panic, not crisis. Just a persistent background awareness that a single unexpected thing, a bigger medical event, a flight home for something worse than a wedding, changes the calculation significantly. I noticed it most in the days after the ear infection, when I was adding 4,500 pesos to the spreadsheet and watching the annual total shift. It lasted about a week, and then it settled. But it was there. That feeling is a cost that doesn't appear in any retirement content I've ever watched. I'm mentioning it because it's real, and because you should know it's part of the package. What the year told me, in summary, the formula works, but the formula is tighter than it looks, and it requires you to model not just the ordinary months, but the months where life intrudes. Flight home for a family occasion. Minor health incident. One social expense you hadn't planned for. These aren't emergencies. They're just life. And on a pension with no surplus, life has to come out of savings. Anyone watching this who is planning to do what I did with less than €30,000 in reserve, I'd ask you to run your numbers again. Not because I'm trying to put you off, because that's the number below which the safety net has holes that matter. The audit was finished by the 3rd of January. I closed the spreadsheet and made a mug of tea and sat at the kitchen table. The Dumaguete kitchen table, not the Clondalkin one, and listened to the street waking up outside. The bread smell from the bakery. A rooster somewhere behind the hardware store, which there always is. I don't know whose it is. Church bells from somewhere up the hill. The 7:30 Mass at the Cathedral of St. Catherine. The first thought, right, now you know what it actually costs. Next year will be better, because now you know. So, February 2025, 14 months in. This is where I am. I renewed the lease. Went to Mr. Velasquez in early January with 3 months' rent in hand. 55,500 pesos, roughly €2,775, and suggested that paying up front might be worth a small adjustment to the monthly rate. He thought about it for a moment in the way he thinks about things, which is slowly and without any apparent anxiety about the silence. He said 18,000 pesos a month. We shook hands. I've been here long enough now that the negotiation felt less like a formality and more like something approaching familiarity. Not friendship exactly, but the kind of mutual respect that develops between two men who have both, in different ways, spent their lives keeping things in working order. The routine, since you've asked, and people do ask, I walk the boulevard most mornings, early, before the heat builds. There's a particular bench past the old church where you can sit and watch the fishing boats coming in from the Visayan Sea. And I sometimes sit there with a coffee I've brought from the apartment and do nothing in particular for 20 minutes, which is not something I was capable of in Clondalkin, and which I'm still not entirely comfortable with, but am getting better at. Market twice a week. The same woman sells me bangus, that's milkfish, and has stopped trying to give me the foreigner price, which I take as a reasonable measure of progress. The hiking group. I should mention the hiking group. There is a hiking group. It meets on Saturday mornings and does trails in the mountains behind the city, up toward Valencia, sometimes further. I joined it in September because Doug mentioned it at the Tuesday coffee in a way that made it sound like he was just describing a fact rather than extending an invitation, which is the only kind of invitation I respond to. There are 12 regular members, about half Filipino, half foreign. We walk for 3 or 4 hours. Nobody talks very much while we're walking, which suits me perfectly. The views from the ridge above Valencia on a clear morning are, well, they're considerable. I'm not going to get into it, but they're considerable. I call the grandchildren on Saturday mornings. Philippine time, which means early afternoon in Vancouver, late evening in Melbourne, and some unholy hour in Toronto that Sion insists doesn't bother him. The calls have gotten longer. I don't know if that's something I did or something that just happens when you stop being the person who's going to come back and become the person who lives somewhere else. Probably both. I'm not going to over-explain it. They're longer. That's enough. Now, the honest answer, properly this time, for anyone watching this who came here for the numbers and not the human interest. €1,800 a month is enough. It is enough. I want to say that clearly, because I've spent most of this video explaining the ways in which it's more complicated than that, and I don't want to leave you thinking it doesn't work. It does work. I'm sitting in Dumaguete in February. It's 28 degrees outside. My rent is paid. My fridge has food in it. And I went to Apo Island last month on a day trip that cost me 1,200 pesos all in. That's about 75 euro. And I watched sea turtles feeding about 3 meters off the reef. 65 years of age. That happened. But here is the specific, honest version of what enough looks like. Because the YouTube version isn't specific enough to be useful. Health insurance from day one. Not optional, not something you price later. 22,000 pesos a month minimum for adequate coverage at 65. Budget for it before you budget for anything else, because if you build your model without it and discover it afterward, your entire model is wrong. 30,000 euro in accessible savings as a minimum reserve. Not invested, not in something that takes 3 weeks to liquidate. Accessible. That's your flight home in an emergency. That's a hospital admission that exceeds your policy excess. That's the year where 2 unexpected things happen instead of 1. Below that number, you're not retired. You're 1 bad month from a decision you don't want to have to make. Model a flight home into your annual budget, not as a contingency, as a line item. Decide at the start of each year, am I going home this year? Yes or no? If yes, budget for it. 700 euros to 900 euros return from Cebu to Dublin, depending on routing and when you book. It's not a surprise if you've planned for it. And the financial boundary thing, I know I've already said this, but I'm going to say it again because it's the thing I most nearly got wrong. Decide what you're willing to give before anyone asks you for anything. Write it down if you need to. The conversation, when it comes, and it will come in some form, because this is a culture where the expectation of mutual support is genuine and real and not a performance, that conversation is not the right time to figure out your position. You won't think straight. You'll give money you can't afford to give and resent it afterwards, or you'll decline and feel like a bad person. And neither of those is the version of yourself you want to be. Know your position. State it clearly. Move on. What nobody tells you, and I mean this quite specifically, is that the psychological cost of a thin margin is real, not ruinous, not the kind of thing that stops you living, but real. It's a low hum, an awareness, always slightly present, that the system has no slack in it. That one significant unplanned expense shifts the whole picture. Most months it sits quietly in the background. Some months, when something happens, it comes forward for a few days, and then recedes. I've learned to regard it the way I'd regard a slightly undersized pipe in a system that's otherwise functioning. It's there, it's a known limitation, and as long as nothing unexpected increases the demand, you're fine. I'm looking into the SRRV, the Special Resident Retirees Visa. It requires a deposit of 20,000 US dollars, roughly 18,500 euro, which you lodge with a Philippine bank and which remains yours, accessible, earning modest interest. In return, you get permanent residency status. No more visa runs to the Bureau of Immigration. No more 4,000 pesos extension fees every 2 months. The maths, I'm working through. It would take about 4 years for the savings on visa fees to justify the deposit. But the convenience factor, and the peace of mind of having legal status that doesn't expire, is worth something that doesn't appear in the spreadsheet. I'll know what I've decided by the time anyone's watching this, probably. Ah, look, that's the honest answer. It works. It's not paradise and it's not disaster. It's a life that costs less than Dublin, in a place that's warm and English-speaking and has decent food and sea turtles, with a margin that requires you to know exactly what you're doing at all times. It works the way plumbing works. Only if the pressure's right and nothing's leaking. Check your pipes before you move in. And that's where we leave Niall Corrigan. Still in Dumaguete, still doing the audit, still walking the boulevard before the heat gets going, sitting on the bench past the church, watching the fishing boats come in. This is inside the Philippines. And what we've tried to do today, what Niall came here and did for you, is the hardest thing to find in this space. A straight answer. Not a sales pitch for a fantasy. Not a warning against a disaster. Just the actual numbers, the actual complications, the actual life. Most of the stories we tell on this channel end somewhere darker than Niall's. The men who lost everything, or nearly everything, or lost the thing they hadn't known they were risking. Those stories matter. But so does this one. Because the question isn't whether you can retire in the Philippines on a fixed pension. The question is whether you've done the honest audit first. Niall did. And the pipes, so far, are holding. If this story was useful to you, if the numbers gave you something to work with, or the warnings landed where they needed to, subscribe. Share it with someone who's asking the same questions. And come back. There are more stories here. Some of them end differently than this one. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you on the next one.